Super Mario World was the ultimate Mario game. It pushed 2D platforming to its absolute limits, running, leaping, and flying right up against the edge of what was possible with 16-bit hardware. Once it burst onto the scene, there was really nothing Nintendo or anyone else could do to improve on its design without turning it into a completely different kind of game. Now, if that statement seems a bit hyperbolic to you, then I ought to point out that this isn't actually my opinion. It's just a somewhat more bombastic paraphrase of the opinion expressed by Nintendo employee Shigefumi Hino, taken from an interview in which he tries to explain why Super Mario World's sequel, Yoshi's Island, took 5 years to make and ended up as something that only barely resembles the classic Mario experiences of the previous decade. Despite the many changes that Super Mario had gone through over his first 5 years, there were certain constants in the overall feel of his games that remained similar. The appearance and movement of Mario himself, the precise nature of the game's platforming mechanics, levels designed to be short and sweet, so that losing a life never felt like too harsh a punishment for failure. Yoshi's Island doesn't so much challenge these staple concepts from previous games as it just ignores them. And what's amazing about that for a seasoned Mario fan is that the game doesn't suffer much for it. Its levels are long and confusing, the platforming is fiddly and easy to mess up, you don't even play as Mario. And yet there's something very integrated about Yoshi's Island, a sense of polish reminding you that this is still a Mario game at the end of the day. Changing just one major thing about a series and leaving the rest of it unaltered can be a serious mistake, because different parts of a game work together to produce an impression, and the chances of a brand new element clashing with the existing ones is always high. So if Shigefumi Hino was right, and elaborating on the old Mario design wasn't going to cut it anymore, then it follows that one major mechanical change wasn't going to be enough to hit the same level of quality as before. Imagine playing as Yoshi, but with levels still designed to suit Mario's abilities. Sure, you could do that in Super Mario World, but that game always allowed you to ditch Yoshi and resume playing as Mario whenever you wanted, not to mention the dozen or so critical stages in which Yoshi didn't appear at all. That's not what I'm talking about. Imagine if Yoshi was all you had, but the stages were still designed to play like Super Mario World. That just wouldn't work. Even in Super Mario World, Yoshi is too slow and restricted in his movements to make the most of Mario's platforming challenges. So at the very least, conceptually, two things had to change: the main character and his abilities, and the stages in order to match those new abilities. But in practice, this entailed lots of other changes too. Enemies would have to change in order to work with the player's new moveset. Set-piece stage elements, like checkpoints, would have to change in accordance with the new level design. And while this wasn't strictly necessary, in order for the game to have its own unique atmosphere, it was probably going to need a new art style as well. Even the incredibly wacky Super Mario Bros. 2 would turn out to be less of a curveball than what Nintendo was about to do. The title on the box may have read Super Mario World 2, but Yoshi's Island was the farthest thing in the world from a simple sequel. It was an entirely different kind of gaming, altogether.
It was an entirely different kind of gaming.
Whoa, Jesus, where did that come from? The way Shigefumi Hino tells it, Yoshi's Island began one day when Shigeru Miyamoto had a meeting with him to discuss his future with Nintendo. Hino had originally been hired as an artist, and he'd done a fantastic job on Super Mario World, but Miyamoto wanted to know how long he planned on doing just art and nothing else. In case it slipped your mind, Miyamoto himself was brought on as an artist and nothing else back in 1977, but within a few years he had graduated to directing his own game project with Donkey Kong, and the rest was history. His own fast-moving experience was probably uppermost in his thoughts when he suggested to Hino that it was time for him to take a step up in responsibility and start being a director. This was already something of a tradition at Nintendo, as you can see from the way the rest of the Mario team branched out into other fields during the early 1990s. Level designer Hideki Kano worked with artist Tadashi Sugiyama to create the blockbuster Super Mario Kart, which brought the Mario touch to a game genre that he was never associated with before. Kensuke Tanabe, who'd also been a level designer on Super Mario Bros. 3, started writing stories for the Zelda series, and ultimately made his mark as one of Nintendo's best liaisons with second- and third-party partners, particularly Retro and Intelligent Systems. And Katsuya Eguchi worked with British developer Argonaut Software, which designed the advanced Super FX chip to maximize the SNES's processing power, to create a 3D-ish rail shooter that would show off the Super FX's power. That was Star Fox, which would go on to become one of Nintendo's most beloved franchises. Miyamoto wanted Hino to put himself out there and make his Super Mario Kart, his Star Fox, and Hino was willing to give it a try. There was only one problem. He didn't have any idea what kind of game he wanted to make. He tested out several different ideas, but none of them went anywhere, and he was just about to give up when he suddenly had a breakthrough. How about a twist on Super Mario World in which you would play as Yoshi instead of Mario? Hino didn't technically create Yoshi, but he was strongly associated with him as a designer. He's the reason Yoshi looks and acts the way he does, and I think it's fair to say he cared more about Yoshi than Miyamoto did, because Miyamoto had lots of creations sharing his affections, and Hino mostly just had Yoshi. In fact, generally speaking, Hino was very much a put all your eggs in one basket kind of guy, unlike Miyamoto, who reveled in working on half a dozen projects at once, adding a pinch of design here and a bright idea there. Although Hino is still a designer at Nintendo today, he's only directed 4 games over the last 30 years, and every one is exceptionally polished, particularly when it comes to visuals. And speaking of visuals, let's take a minute here to discuss the art style of Yoshi's Island, since it's possibly the most iconic thing about it. Shigefumi Hino and Takashi Tezuka, who mentored him throughout development, agreed from the very beginning that the game should have a distinctive art style, preferably something that would show off the SNES's advanced graphical capabilities, while also retaining the cartoonish charm of Mario's earlier outings. The success of Donkey Kong Country and its 3D rendered sprites actually shooed the team away from realism, because imitating the real three-dimensional world now felt like an arms race that they couldn't possibly win. So the art team consciously chose to make the exact opposite, a painterly world with the feel of a storybook. One of the 2 artists who helped bring this dream to life was Yoshiaki Koizumi, then an illustrator and scriptwriter, but now probably best known in the West as the public face of the Nintendo Switch during its launch in 2017. We'll be seeing more from him later, since he's had basically the same role in the Mario series over the last 15 years that Shigeru Miyamoto did during its first 15 years. But here he was mostly just responsible for the CG animation. You know, like Mode 7! The other artist was a man named Hisashi Nogami, and he was the one responsible for translating Hino's hand-drawn vision into reality. The way this was accomplished was an interesting mix of high and low tech. Backgrounds, for instance, were actually hand-drawn on paper with crayons and colored pencils and such, then scanned into high-resolution computer files and digitized to display properly on the SNES. Obviously, this couldn't be done with foreground elements like platforms and enemies, which have to move around and transfer smoothly between various sprites. And in fact, if you look just at the sprites, Yoshi's Island actually appears way more like Super Mario World than you might think. But here, there was an attempt at a sort of markery style, with sharp outlines, bright colors, and gradients galore, not to mention a larger allotment of different sprites and animations for each character. The result is a game that's just as fun to watch in action as it is to play, for me at least. And that's not because the game isn't much fun to play. While the visuals are the most obviously innovative aspect of Yoshi's Island, that same spirit of artsiness is present in its gameplay. Here's why that's a problem, though, and I don't mean an overall problem with the game, I mean a problem I have right now with this video series. You may have noticed already that the runtime for this video is pretty short for such a landmark game, but there's a reason for that. This series is supposed to be about how the Mario games built off of and influenced each other, the Mario legacy. And Yoshi's Island is so freewheelingly creative that in the end it didn't add much to that legacy. Not much of what it came up with made sense after Mario resumed his usual place as the protagonist. Now there have been other Yoshi games since this, and Yoshi's Island had a huge influence on them, as well as a fairly substantial one on various Mario RPGs and other spin-offs. But as far as the main series is concerned, this is a dead end. A beautiful one to be sure, maybe even the best 2D game associated with the Mario series. But pull back from that breathtaking view and you'll find that you're standing in a cul-de-sac. So while I am going to discuss this game's overall design, I won't be covering all the unique things it does in any great detail. I'm just going to hit the highlights and move on. Anyway, enough shop talk. The unusual nature of Yoshi's Island is apparent from the very beginning, in which for the first time an animated cutscene is used to convey the game's premise. We see that a stork is delivering the infant Mario and Luigi to their parents when the evil Magikoopa Kamek, a servant of the prince who rules over the Koopas, attacks and manages to carry off one of the babies, having foreseen that if they are allowed to grow up, they will become the Koopas' greatest enemy. By pure chance, however, one of the 2 baby bundles slips out of his grasp and lands on the island of the Yoshis, who find baby Mario wrapped inside it the next day. Being friendly creatures, who also don't have a heck of a lot to do, the Yoshis decide to take turns carrying the infant to his parents, using a map that fell down with him. And without their even knowing it, this puts a target on their back and places them on a collision course with the evil Kamek, who is determined to recapture Mario and do whatever nefarious things he was going to do in the first place. Seriously though, the game stops short of saying Kamek intends to kill the babies, for obvious reasons, but you don't have to be a genius to work this one out. This isn't a much more complicated story than those in previous Mario games, but am I wrong in thinking that it's kind of brilliant? It's got drama and pathos that you didn't see in most video games of any kind back then. There are powerful, even archetypal literary tropes at play here. The destruction of innocence to prevent a prophecy of doom to evildoers, a lost human child being raised by friendly animals, a quest to return home against the opposition of a broomstick-riding wizard and his winged minions. This is heavy stuff for a game clearly aimed at kids. In keeping with this old-fashioned story, Yoshi's Island has an old-fashioned structure, an even simpler one in fact than that found in Super Mario Bros. Here you progress through 6 worlds of 8 stages each, with no shortcuts and no skipping allowed. Every stage requires you to run through the whole thing from beginning to end, and locked doors in most stages also require you to slow down occasionally and hunt for keys. Generally speaking, Yoshi's Island is a slower-paced and more deliberate game than Super Mario World. There are times when you're punished for not thinking quickly, but most of the time it's best to pause and get your bearings before jumping into a new set of challenges. Enemies have lots of unusual abilities and behaviors, and it's almost certain you'll get dinged by them several times before you figure out what to do. This is compensated for by a new health system, in which you no longer go from powered up to tiny to dead in just a few hits. Instead, health now takes the form of a 10-second timer, which counts down whenever you're separated from Baby Mario, usually by being attacked. If you can find and grab Baby Mario before the timer hits 0, your health will slowly tick back up to 10. This can also be extended by finding stars in the stage, up to a maximum of 30 seconds. You would think a game with a system like this might be a bit too easy, but in practice, Yoshi's Island can be quite difficult. Since getting hit isn't the end of the world anymore, the designers felt comfortable absolutely stuffing the stages with hazards, outdoing even the occasionally chaotic Super Mario World. Not only that, but falling into a pit, plus certain other hazards like spikes or lava, still results in an immediate death, and this game's worlds are pitted like crazy. Just as they were comfortable putting more enemies in a room because of the new health system, the designers allowed themselves to make stages full of pits, including some where there's hardly any solid ground, because of a change to the main character's moveset that allowed players to keep themselves aloft for much longer without resorting to flying like Mario. This is the flutter jump, in which Yoshi grits his teeth and kicks furiously against the air beneath him, which, thanks to technically unexplainable cartoon logic, actually reduces his downward acceleration to the point that he briefly starts to rise up again, until he runs out of energy and resumes falling. What separates this from your basic video game double jump are 2 important properties. First of all, the flutter jump can be used over and over again, making it an invaluable recovery move to get back to solid ground after botching a section of platforming. And second, it's incapable of raising Yoshi above the apex of his original jump, meaning it can't be used to completely bypass platforming challenges most of the time. Attempting to do this with just the flutter jump usually results in a lot of drawn-out and tragicomically hilarious deaths. But arguably, the biggest change to Yoshi's moveset compared to Mario's is his ability to collect and throw eggs to defeat enemies and hit special targets. Kind of like Yoshi himself in Super Mario World, eggs occupy this strange middle ground where they're technically a power-up that you find in the overworld, but they're so common and easily replenishable that they feel like a basic move. Uses for eggs, both optional and mandatory, are scattered everywhere throughout Yoshi's Island, and while you could theoretically get through many stages without them, you really wouldn't want to. And then we have the one big move that Yoshi's Island introduced which stuck around, the ground pound. With this move, Yoshi can slam his butt into the ground in much the same way that Bowser did at the end of Super Mario Bros. 3, to defeat enemies, hammer down stumps, and break open wooden chests. Its uses in this game are usually pretty specific, and when it comes to platforming, it does a lot more harm than good. But for better or for worse, this is the one move that Mario decided to copy from his dinosaurian buddy. It appeared immediately after this in Super Mario 64. Then in spin-offs like Mario Party and Super Smash Bros., and from then on it was a staple move that practically all characters in the series eventually learned how to do. Another element that reappeared in Super Mario 64, which may have slipped your notice, is the concept of red coins. Super Mario World's Dragon Coins were the first new type of coin in the Mario series, but all they did is give you 1-ups. The red coins in this game are essential to getting a high score on each stage, and their counterparts in Super Mario 64 led to Power Stars. The new Super Mario Bros. Series relegated them to the status of power-up and extra life dispensers, and it would appear that Nintendo has phased them out completely these days in favor of fancily shaped purple coins. But give me a good old-fashioned red coin any day, I say. And yeah, it feels weird bringing up coin types as if that's a huge part of Mario, but I have to talk about this stuff, because the influence in more important areas just isn't there. Take enemies, for instance. Yoshi's Island has only a single enemy that appeared in any subsequent mainline Mario game, and it's really just a variation on an existing enemy. The Fly Guy, a shy guy with a propeller on his head who dangles helpful items in front of you and then flies away snickering. I do suppose that Yoshi's Island deserves some credit for popularizing Shy Guys, and their close cousins the Sniffets, who had only appeared in one Mario game previously. This game just loves Shy Guys, and uses variants of them in all sorts of places where other enemies would have worked just as well. While he's mostly absent from the mainline Mario games, Shy Guy is omnipresent in spin-offs, and arguably one of the biggest brand mascots Mario has, right up there with Boo and Thwomp, and just below the mighty Goomba. And that might not have happened if he hadn't been given a starring role here. It's hard to say, really. I've heard people claim that Ukiki from Super Mario 64 is another point of continuity between it and Yoshi's Island, but to me this seems like a massive stretch. The monkeys in this game are a common enemy, with several subtypes, none of which resemble Ukiki in their behavior. Not to mention that Ukiki is a unique set piece who only appears in one level. I mean, yeah, they look similar. That's because they're both just monkeys. Speaking of stretches, people also say that Kamek from this game shows up at the beginning of Super Mario Galaxy. Even though he looks exactly like a generic Magic Koopa, you never fight him, and he gets to deliver a princely one line of dialogue before disappearing for the entire rest of the game. All I can say to that is that this had better not be Kamek, because he's far too interesting a character to be disrespected like this. That would be like hiring Keanu Reeves to be in a Fast and Furious sequel as some guy working at a gas station who just looks up and waves as the cars go by. Kamek has appeared in other games, but only the Yoshi sequels and RPGs, and he doesn't even show up in all of those. The Paper Mario series replaces him with a distaff counterpart named Cammy. The only character from this game who's both new and showed up in another mainline Mario game is, weirdly enough, Poochie, the silly dog whose tongue is always hanging out. Yep, the only one who doesn't speak a single word, and he's the one they bring back for Super Mario Odyssey. Plus, this is more a cameo than a proper reappearance. I mean, you barely interact with him. I don't think Poochie really is Poochie if he isn't growling constantly and occasionally dumping you into a sea of lava because he got distracted by a passing bat. And that's really the crop, as far as the Mario series is concerned. One major new move, a coin variant, a single new enemy, and a weird little dog who you get to see 2 decades later in a photograph. Everything else in this game, the vast creative panorama that it contains, is either confined to spin-offs or never shows up again. The only other thing I can think of that's sort of stuck around is that animated intro cutscene, with its fairy tale storybook quality. The intros to both Super Mario Galaxy and its sequel, not to mention Rosalina's Cozy Luma Storytime sessions in Galaxy, clearly owe something to the influence of Yoshi's Island. I also get a bit of that same feeling from Super Mario 3D Land's animated postcards, but here the inspiration was almost certainly from Super Mario Bros. 3, with its end-of-world letters. So why is this, you might ask? Why did future Mario games not avail themselves of this bounty of great ideas that are in Yoshi's Island? I think the answer has to do with Nintendo's long-term strategy as a game studio. Over Mario's first decade in the spotlight, games starring him tended to be made for one of two reasons. Because Nintendo needed a blockbuster for financial or strategic reasons, or because somebody came up with an interesting idea and pushed for it. And this first type of game has generally seen more of its innovations retained in future Mario games compared with the second. The original Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario World fall into the first category. Nintendo greenlit the production of Super Mario Bros. In the first place because they were about to unveil the Famicom Disk System, and didn't want it to seem like they were abandoning the original Famicom. Super Mario World was to be Nintendo's first big-budget foray into a new console generation, and they needed it to move consoles. With these games, the technology came first, and the team's imagination worked around it. The second and third Super Mario games were more like Yoshi's Island, projects that grew out of the team's efforts to use technology they were thoroughly familiar with to go in a new creative direction. They tend to be more polished than the other kind of Mario game because they're made by a more experienced team. But that also makes it harder to reuse their elements in future games, because those elements are specialized to fit the specific platform they were developed for. Yoshi's Island is uncannily similar to Super Mario Bros. 2 in its level design, its enemy roster, and even its hero. Remember, Super Mario Bros. 2 is also the only other game so far that let you play as someone other than Mario. Super Mario Bros. 3 is where this dichotomy breaks down a little, since it wasn't technology-driven, but was highly influential. I think this can be explained by the unusual continuity of development between Super Mario Bros. 3 and the next game in the series. Super Mario World was developed by almost entirely the same team, and it even started life as a 16-bit port of Super Mario Bros. 3. So when they were faced with new design problems, this team was likely to look back on what they'd already done and adapt an existing concept to new circumstances rather than invent something totally new. Yoshi's Island would not have this advantage in legacy terms. While the project started out with the guidance of experienced Mario designers like Takashi Tezuka and Hideki Kano, midway through development they were reassigned to focus on the higher priority Super Mario 64, which would be a technology-driven project, and which was virtually guaranteed to outsell Yoshi's Island. For months at a time, the design of this game was handled by just 3 people: Shigefumi Hino, Hisashi Nogami, and an unspecified third designer. With so little supervision from the keepers of the Mario Flame, they could do practically whatever they wanted. Nogami noted that there were many days when he would design a new enemy in the morning, send it to the programmers at noon, and have it already incorporated into the game by the time he left for the day. No other Mario game had ever been made with such creative freedom, but that freedom was only possible because it didn't matter that much to the rest of Nintendo whether this game was successful or not. Yoshi's Island is a beautiful game, whether you're talking about its graphics, its storytelling, or the obvious care and affection that were lavished on it, but it wasn't the future of the Mario series. Mario was about to venture into a place where his experience of being carried around in a sack by a talking dinosaur was completely useless. It was an undiscovered country in which everything he knew would be transformed. The journey that awaited him was broader, blockier, and backflippier than anything he'd ever known. Where he was going, he didn't need checkpoints.